On the morning of D-Day 1944, leading generals like Omar Bradley and Dwight Eisenhower watched from a safe distance, one from the deck of a ship, one from the comfort of an English manor. Every senior American general in the European theatre was exactly where doctrine said they should be, behind the lines, safe from fire. All except one. Standing at the open door of a C-47 screaming over Normandy, holding an M1 rifle, was Brigadier General James Gavin, about to do something no American general had ever done. Jump into the deadliest invasion in human history alongside the men he commanded. But how does an orphan boy from Brooklyn go on to become a 2-star general of the lethal 82nd Airborne? The answer spans 4 countries, 4 combat jumps, and 422 days of continuous warfare. And it starts here. On that same morning of D-Day, while the beaches of Normandy were being soaked in American blood, Gavin was organising a handful of scattered paratroopers near a stone bridge over the flooded Mer d'Arrée River. For 3 days, his men held that bridge under continuous fire, and on June 9th, when the order came to charge 500 yards of open causeway, single file, no cover, and with German machine guns firing from 3 directions, Brigadier General James Gavin stood in the open as bullets tore through the air around him. A man whose rank demanded he stay behind the lines was standing exactly where his men were dying. But to understand the insanity of why a Brigadier General would risk his life standing in the open when every instinct says get down, we have to go back to where he started. Born in Brooklyn, 1907, as an orphan, James Gavin was adopted in 1909 by Martin and Mary Gavin, a working-class Irish couple from Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania, deep in the anthracite coal belt. By his 17th birthday in 1924, he was terrified of exactly one future: going underground into the mines like his father and never coming back up. So he ran, took the night train to New York City on his birthday, walked into a recruiting station and lied about his age to enlist. But Gavin had one problem. A working-class upbringing in a coal town had left him with years of missed formal education. Algebra, geometry, English, history, subjects most West Point candidates had studied for years. Gavin had barely touched them. So every morning, at 4:30 a.m, while everyone else slept, he sat in the bathroom, the only room with enough light, and taught himself everything he had missed. After years of that relentless self-education, he made it to West Point, graduating in the class of 1929. A working-class orphan from a Pennsylvania coal town, sitting amongst the sons of generals and politicians. It was at West Point where Gavin became obsessed with something most American military officers were completely ignoring: the German Fallschirmjäger, Germany's elite paratroopers. Men who dropped from the sky behind enemy lines to seize critical terrain before conventional forces could react. While most American officers dismissed the concept as reckless, Gavin saw something nobody else did: the future of warfare. Because of that obsession, the once near-illiterate kid from a coal mining town sat down and wrote Field Manual 31-30, the United States Army's first ever doctrine on airborne warfare. When asked later what made his career advance so fast, his answer was 4 words: I wrote the book. And then he volunteered to prove every word of it, at 34 years old, when every officer his age was chasing a safe staff position as far from the front line as possible. On the night of July 9th, 1943, Colonel James Gavin led 3,400 men aboard 226 C-47 transports towards southeastern Sicily. Their mission was to seize strategic crossroads behind enemy lines and block German armour from reaching the invasion beaches. But what followed was a catastrophe. Winds of 35 miles per hour, more than double the safe training limit, combined with pilots who had never flown a combat mission, scattered those 3,400 paratroopers across 60 miles of Sicilian countryside. Some men landed 25 miles from their drop zone, Others came down in the sea and drowned. With his force shattered across the Sicilian countryside, Gavin assembled fewer than 20 men, and did what he would do for the rest of the war: marched toward the guns. What he was marching toward, he didn't yet know. By July 11th, he had arrived at Piazza Ridge, a 100-foot elevation that stood between 17 Tiger I heavy tanks and the vulnerable Allied beachheads at Gela. If those tanks reached the beach, the entire Sicilian invasion would be pushed back into the sea. Gavin had no tanks, no artillery, and no communication with the beachhead. But he had something the German commander hadn't accounted for: a man who had no intention of moving. Throughout the day his force grew. Scattered paratroopers pulled from the Sicilian countryside, assembling around the one officer who seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. A trooper found Gavin that day in a shallow hole scraped into the shale, further forward than every single one of his men, closer to the German line than anyone. When the trooper gasped for water, Gavin offered his own canteen. "Here, son, take some of mine." His order to his men was absolute. "We are staying on this goddamned ridge no matter what happens." They stayed. By evening, 6 Sherman tanks arrived, and Gavin ordered a counterattack, driving the Hermann Göring division from the ridge and forcing the German commander to abandon his push toward the Allied beachhead entirely. A decision that, according to the official army history, saved the Sicilian invasion at its most vulnerable moment. The template was set. But 1 year later, Gavin would take it further than anyone thought possible. On September 17th, 1944, Gavin made his 4th combat jump into Holland. On landing, he fractured 2 vertebrae in his spine, and at that point any reasonable man, any reasonable general, would have reported to the medics, handed command over, and nobody would have questioned it. Instead, Gavin said nothing. For 2 months, he commanded the most complex airborne operation in American history with a broken back, and not a single person knew. But the broken back was not the hardest sacrifice he would make that September. After 2 days of failed frontal assaults on the fortified Nijmegen Bridge, Gavin ordered an assault crossing of the 400-yard-wide Vaal River, in broad daylight, in 26 collapsible canvas boats, against German machine guns, mortars, and artillery firing from both banks simultaneously. Every instinct and every bone in his broken spine told him to direct it from a safe distance. Instead, he stood on the riverbank, as close to the water as he could get, watching his men die in front of him as bullets tore through the boats around them. The only thing that kept him off that river was his back. Major Julian Cook led the first wave. His lieutenants rowed to the rhythm of the rosary, but more than half of the 260 troops in that first wave were killed or wounded crossing those 400 yards, with only 13 of the 26 boats reaching the far bank, where the survivors clawed ashore and stormed German positions with bayonets and grenades. The bridge was captured with hours to spare, because 11 miles away in Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division was already being destroyed, and every minute had mattered. Sicily had been chaos, but just 2 months later, on September 13th, 1943, Gavin's second ever combat jump would prove that chaos could be learned from. The Allied beachhead at Salerno was on the verge of collapse. German forces were pushing the invasion back toward the sea, and General Mark Clark sent a 3-word message to Ridgway that said everything. This is a must. That night, Gavin's 505th jumped onto the beachhead with precision, and within 24 hours, 2 parachute regiments had stabilised the faltering beachhead and pushed forward to enter Naples, becoming the first Allied force to liberate a major European city. Then came Normandy, the jump that changed everything. A drop worse than anything that had come before. 60% of all heavy equipment lost. 1/3 of the division unaccounted for after 24 hours. What followed was 33 consecutive days of combat. No relief, no replacements, and a 46% casualty rate, and not 1 foot of ground ever given back. 2 months later, Gavin was handed command of the entire 82nd Airborne Division. And 2 months after that, At just 37 years old, he was promoted to Major General, the youngest to hold that rank since the American Civil War. And then he walked away. In 1958, Gavin resigned his career rather than endorse Eisenhower's New Look policy, a strategy that gutted the Army's budget in favour of nuclear deterrence, leaving America with no credible capability to fight conventional wars. Gavin argued that limited wars were far more likely than a nuclear exchange. The Pentagon disagreed. Within a decade, America was fighting exactly the kind of war Gavin had warned about, in the jungles of Vietnam, with an army that wasn't prepared for it. The youngest and only general in American history to write the doctrine, jump into combat 4 times to prove it, and fight alongside the men he commanded. James Gavin. One of a kind.